I'm Soccer Hunter, and welcome to the Explain It to Me podcast. EITM Pod is about info without gatekeeping and encouraging curiosity, community, and education without drowning in jargon. This is part 2 of my miniseries about the X-Men and the rest of Marvel Comics mutants. Today's topic is who are the players and groups it helps to know. Before we get into it, can you do me a favor? Please like, rate, and subscribe to EITM Pod so the algorithms will let us grow this show into what I believe it can be. Thank you. I appreciate it and you. So, this is the structure I'm going to use in this video. First, what are the teams that matter most? Both historically and if you want to just approach the current comics / movies / cartoons / etc. Second, who are the most important heroes who do not easily fit into just one of those teams / lineups? Third, who are the most important mutant villains? I will leave discussing non-mutant adversaries to when they come up in stories we'll discuss in parts 3 and 4. And fourth, a few words on honorable mentions, aka people who are not mutants, or have at times not been mutants. So, first, what are the key teams? Well, it all starts with the original team, often called the O5. That's Cyclops, Beast, Iceman, Angel, and Jean Grey / Marvel Girl. This team, along with eventually Cyclops' brother Havoc and Magneto's daughter Polaris, were the core X-Men team from the first issue in 1963 until Giant Size X-Men #1 in 1975, when the so-called all new, all different team / era began. Besides featuring in flashback stories or retellings like X-Men's Season 1 by Dennis Hopeless, the 1960s O5 actually traveled forward in time to the then present day of 2012 through 2018 and interacted with their future selves and their legacies before returning to their own time. Then, starting in 1975's Giant Size X-Men #1, the all-new, all-different team launched a new era. New characters like Storm, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Banshee, Sunfire, and Thunderbird, along with, originally, a Incredible Hulk villain, but now one of the biggest superheroes of all, Wolverine. They joined O5 team members, especially Cyclops and Jean Grey. And this started with X-Men issue 94. That was the team that launched Chris Claremont's legendary run as the X-Men's writer. The X-Men were no longer a team of students under Claremont, which was a big part of the book back when Stan Lee and Jack Kirby created the team. So the next big team to know about then is the New Mutants, which in 1982 was the next class of would-be X-Men in training. While I'm not sure which characters will be relevant going forward in the comics or TV / movies, Sunspot, aka Roberto da Costa, featured heavily in the recent X-Men 97 cartoon. So familiarity with him, his best friend and sometimes fellow Avenger Cannonball, aka Sam Guthrie, Cypher, who became very important during the Krakoan era, and Colossus' sister Magic, spelled with a K, might be worth knowing. Or at least because the New Mutants original series led into the theme / series X-Force, once the New Mutants were no longer led by Xavier or Magneto, but rather by Cyclops' son Cable. X-Force has changed a lot over the years in both lineup and mission statement / approach. Generally, it was the more extreme / violent X-Men team, and eventually it was a straight up mutant Black Ops squad. Often this group included new mutant characters, and later often Wolverine, but also ones I haven't mentioned yet, like Psylocke and Deadpool. I'll talk about those two more later, but anyway, before the New Mutants became X-Force in 1991, another spin-off team, Excalibur, was launched in 1987, with a supporting cast coming partly out of the UK-based Captain Britain comics, but also co-starring Nightcrawler from the all-new, all-different team, Kitty Pryde, who I'll get into, and an alternate universe daughter of Jean Grey and Cyclops, named Rachel Summers, who back then used her mom's occasional codename Phoenix. Excalibur was a weird combination of characters, with some wacky stories, as it was Europe's premier and seemingly only mutant superhero team. The name's been used by other teams over the years, most notably during Krakoa by the original Psylocke, Betsy Braddock, replacing her brother as Captain Britain, and with her fighting alongside Rachel Summers. This run returned the team to its magical, King Arthur-inspired, very soap opera-y roots. The only other teams you really need to know about, though, are one, that in the early 1990s, the X-Men split into blue and gold teams / squads, as there were at that time two main X-Men books, Uncanny X-Men and what's called Adjectiveless. So X-Men number 1, volume 2, the best-selling comic of all time, that's Adjectiveless X-Men in this case. And two, after New Mutants became X-Force, the series about the next generation of mutants, and the next generation of mutant heroes in training, was in the 1990s, appropriately called Generation X. This team, Gen X, was led by Banshee of the all-new, all-different era, and a former villain, first introduced in the Dark Phoenix saga, who I'll get to in a bit. Her name was Emma Frost. Generation X was often a you had to be there sort of comic for a while, with a small but devoted fan base. But several characters, like Synch, Synch, and M/Penance/Monet, they became big deals in other books afterwards. Specifically, the recent Krakoan era, in the case of Synch, and with Monet also in books from the 2000s, like X Factor Volume 3 by Peter David, sometimes called X Factor Investigations. Another member of Gen X, Paige Guthrie, aka Husk, who, like her big brother Cannonball from the New Mutants and X-Force, became an X-Men for a while. But when it comes to her, I'll leave the details of that for any discussion of the Chuck Austen era in the next 2 episodes. So, while there have been other squads, like 2 very different X-Men Red teams, one led by the red-headed Jean Grey, and the other based on the red planet we call Mars, and the Krakoan books even had a pirate ship-based team called the Marauders, this list of teams should get you started. Now, part 2. The key individuals not tied specifically to a team. And this is when we have to talk about Kitty Pryde and Jubilation Lee. Each of these women debuted in 1980 and 1989 respectively as point-of-view characters for the readers, and somewhat defined the X-Men team in a certain era. Kitty Pryde can phase or walk through objects and walls, and Jubilee can create fireworks that basically are colorful, explosive plasma. And in both cases, specific readers, or in the case of Jubilee, also viewers of the 1990s cartoon as well, are particularly attached to them, even to the point that Kitty Pryde is often the dream girlfriend of many a teenage X-Men fan, and that even applies to writers once they grow up and get a chance to write her, like Brian Michael Bendis did during the time-traveling '05 era that I mentioned earlier, and Joss Whedon of Buffy the Vampire Slayer fame in his Astonishing X-Men run. Buffy is heavily inspired by, as a character, on Kitty Pryde. And Kitty, then going by Kate, was also the captain of that mutant pirate ship version of the Marauders. However, in the case of both Kitty and Jubilee, each at times got shifted off the X-Men to other teams. Kitty first as a supporting character in the New Mutants, before then becoming a star of Excalibur, and for Jubilee as both Wolverine's sidekick in his solo book and as a part of the team in Generation X. I think in many ways it is hard to approach Claremont's run from the Dark Phoenix saga through Fall of the Mutants, when she leaves Uncanny X-Men, to form Excalibur without a focus on Kitty Pryde. And in a similar way, reading any early 1990s comics or watching the cartoon show without Jubilee front and center in the books featuring her. Speaking of the 1980s going into the 90s, Nathan Summers, aka Cable, who I mentioned before, is hugely important when it comes to Jean and Cyclops, Apocalypse, who I'll discuss later, the New Mutant / X-Force, and even Deadpool stories, since 1986 and even more so starting in 1990. There's a reason Deadpool 2, as played by Josh Brolin in 2018, and X-Men 97 earlier this year, both made Cable such an important character in certain storylines. Psylocke is another interesting example of an 80s character who became a much bigger deal in the 1990s. Except, the reason wasn't her riding the wave of macho, commando-style action heroes with big guns like with Cable, but instead because Betsy Braddock was a British supermodel with a spy background and psychic powers who then became a Asian ninja / assassin in a one-piece swimsuit through a body swap with the current Psylocke, a woman named Kwannon. Kwannon. There's a lot going on there. But Betsy Braddock was Psylocke and is now Captain Britain. She was in Kwannon's body, but now Kwannon is Psylocke all by herself. Next. Two characters that are about as divisive as you can get, but are both really important. First, Sage, aka Tessa, who first appeared as Tessa in 1980 during the Dark Phoenix saga, but in the early 2000s, Extreme X-Men, X-Treme, Sage's connections to the X-Men secretly going back all the way to the '05 are revealed. He's complicated. He seems very precious to Chris Claremont, and most recently was tied in the Krakoan era to the CIA-style Black Ops form of X-Force, written by Benjamin Percy. Her mind works like a computer, and she is a pretty lady who is terrific at running things and finding out info, basically. Next, there's Quentin Quire, aka Kid Omega, who went from being a fly-in-the-ointment antagonist in Grant Morrison's hugely influential early 2000s run on New X-Men to a major part of the team in Jason Aaron's Wolverine and the X-Men series from the early 2010s, to a key part of X-Force in the 2020s. Quentin has had an arc since his debut 21 years ago, likely as striking as his pink hair. He has tremendous psychic powers that can manifest physically / visibly in forms such as pink shotguns, and he's known for messages on his t shirts, like Magneto was right. Now, before I get to the mutant villains, I want to mention Laura Kinney, aka X-23, also known as Wolverine. She is the daughter slash clone of the main Wolverine, Logan. So think Hugh Jackman, except he's about a foot shorter in the comics. And after her being in movies like Logan, played by Daphne Keane, and most likely the new Deadpool and Wolverine movie, which has yet to be released as I record this, I thought I should mention her too. She is basically a young woman version of the Logan Wolverine, except with two claws in each hand instead of three, and one in each foot. X-23 was her code name until she assumed the Wolverine title in Tom Taylor's All New Wolverine series in 2015. And now she and Logan share the name when Marvel lets them. Okay, so what about the baddies? Well, I discussed the Master of Magnetism, Magneto, quite a bit in the last episode, so I'll leave him for now, including how he's not always written as a villain. Then there is Apocalypse, who I mentioned before. He is a big gray and blue man obsessed with a version of survival of the fittest, and is one of the main baddies in the cartoon show and at certain points in the comic as well. His story is complicated and goes all the way back to ancient Egypt, and famously, an alternate timeline slash universe called the Age of Apocalypse showed a iconic version of the world he would have created had the X-Men not been around to fight him. Apocalypse's former associate, and long time, as in all the way back to the Victorian era, long time, his opponent is Nathaniel Essex, aka Mr. Sinister. He's pale white with a red diamond on his forehead. He is a recurring bad guy in the cartoon. Was hugely influential in the Krakoan era, even getting his own event called The Sins of Sinister. Essex has an obsession with Cyclops, Jean Grey, and their family's bloodlines. He has been written as both a campy villain, but also as a manipulating eugenicist with superpowers. Interestingly, he's only actually a mutant baddie because he stole an X gene from the fallen body of all new, all different X-Men Thunderbird, the first casualty of the X-Men. He's that kind of guy. We should also discuss Sebastian Shaw of the Hellfire Club, a fellow Pittsburgher who was played by Kevin Bacon in the movie X-Men First Class, and Emma Frost, aka the White Queen, originally of the Hellfire Club, but now firmly a heroic member of the X-Men, after first leading Generation X, as I mentioned, but then joining the main team under Grant Morrison. Shaw gets stronger by absorbing energy, including the punches you throw at him, and Emma is a psychic, like Jean Grey, who can turn herself into living diamond form, similar to Colossus with steel. And finally, when dealing with Grant Morrison's run, plus the upcoming Wolverine and Deadpool movie, we must mention Charles Xavier's evil twin, Cassandra Nova. For Cassandra Nova, imagine Professor X's telekinetic and telepathic powers, but in a person completely without conscience or concern for the lives of others. Besides Morrison's new X-Men, she was also a big deal in the first volume of X-Men Red, the Jean Grey one, and the second volume of Marauders, the one that sadly isn't really about mutant pirates anymore. Okay. Now, we've done the teams, the individuals who bounce around, and the mutant baddies. Now let's mention briefly those characters that are a bit of square pegs in round holes. These are either non-mutants or those who have been, didn't used to be, or might be again mutants slash X-Men. First and foremost, there is Deadpool. His real name is not actually Ryan Wilson, though it seems at times. Instead, it's Wade Wilson. Ryan Reynolds said it's Wade Wilson, who he is not a mutant by birth. Rather, he had Wolverine's healing factor implanted into him. The so-called Merc with a mouth is probably the most identifiable mutant who isn't a mutant. Whether that is good or bad likely comes down to how you feel about comic book characters breaking the fourth wall, aka talking to the audience, or I guess Ryan Reynolds generally. This is compared to the current Ms. Marvel, aka Kamala Khan. The current Captain Marvel, when she was Ms. Marvel, was a longtime X-Men ally, but Kamala Khan was not a mutant until recently. And that happened first on the Disney Plus TV show in July of 22, but then in the comics a year later. Since her debut, just over 10 years ago, not only has she been one of the most popular slash promising characters Marvel has debuted in this century, but also a great example of the legacy of the Marvel bankruptcy and the sale of the movie rights to Fox. See, Marvel wanted what are called Inhumans to be rivals to the X-Men in popularity, and it has been argued for the X-Men brand and movie rights to be something they could buy back from Fox on the cheap. This, arguably, has led to the creation slash promotion of a bunch of Inhuman characters, like Kamala Khan, but also storylines like they aren't mutants like we've been saying for years, they're secretly something else. That twist was for Scarlet Witch, Wanda Maximoff, and her brother Quicksilver, Pietro Maximoff. But now that Disney owns all of the rights from Fox and from Marvel Studios, Kamala Khan is now an Inhuman and a mutant. With her mutant power basically just how her power is shown on the TV show. And as for Wanda herself, she is now welcomed back into the X-Men's good graces after being pushed out due to that supposed editorial slash corporate directive. That storyline happened especially in Sword Volume 2, Number 6 by Al Ewing, which is set during the 2021 Hellfire Gala, the subsequent Trial of Magneto miniseries by Leah Williams, which came out of her X Factor run, and the 2023 to present day Scarlet Witch series by Steve Orlando, which altogether reconciled the Scarlet Witch with her dad, Magneto. Who, because Marvel wanted Elizabeth Olsen to play the Scarlet Witch in Avengers movie, is no longer her biological father. But also, she's made up with all of mutant kind after depowering millions of them in the House of M and Decimation storylines. Marvel seemed, with that Decimation event, to prefer nuking the value of the X-Men brand and making most of the characters no longer superheroes, instead of just playing nicely with 20th Century Fox. Wanda made up with mutants basically by using her magic to allow long-dead X-Men a chance to come back from the dead. This notably included founding member of All New, All Different X-Men Thunderbird in Giant-Sized Thunderbird number 1, who was, as I said, the first casualty the X-Men ever took. He had been dead 45 years at that point in publication history, but I don't think he and Mr. Sinister have ever discussed, at least on panel, that X-Gene theft of his body issue. But overall, when it comes to the X-Men and the teams, a lot has changed. People who have become mutants or revealed to be mutants, who weren't before, and others have come back into the fold when they were pushed out for IP reasons. So, unless I'm going to spend the next 5 to 50 minutes telling you to read Gwenpool and Squirrel Girl comics, which are one fantastic and also both mutant, they are both mutant adjacent delights, I should wrap this episode up. So, as you can see, since the 05 in 1963, the all new, all different team in 1975, through the expansion in the late 80s and 90s, the teams and lineups of the X-Men have changed a lot. Some folks have stayed on the page nearly the whole time, like Cyclops, while others haven't exactly become household names, such as Sunfire from the all new, all different era, or Longshot from the 80s, or Cecilia Reyes from the late 1990s/bankruptcy era. All of those characters featured in many, many stories. But to my knowledge, only Cecilia Reyes has shown up on screen, which is obviously key to becoming well known, and that was in the New Mutants movie few people watched, even fewer liked, and because of Disney buying Fox, no one thinks matters narratively at all. But what about the stories that do matter? What are the story arcs and issues that shaped the X-Men and these associated teams? How did the characters I mentioned today reach their highest highs and lowest lows? That, my friends, is the subject of the next episode. I hope you stay tuned for it and for the episodes that follow. But so you don't miss out, please subscribe to help me grow EITM Pod. And if you could, tell your friends about the show. In the meantime, if you have any questions or suggestions for future topics, including things that are not comic book or TV related, personal finance, or whatever you might like, I can be reached at eitmpod@gmail.com. And if you're willing to help the show monetarily, you can go to ko-fi.com/eitmpod, ko-fi.com/eitmpod. So, until next time, please stay safe out there. God bless, and thanks for your time.